Hello, Hibiscus. So I want to try something new on my YouTube channel, and this series is very much inspired by you all. So earlier this year, I created a series on TikTok where I broke down America's Vedic charts. And for some reason, one thing I wasn't expecting was as I was going through the different astrological placements and aligning them with what has been in America and what will be, so many people felt validated and seen in regards to their experience within America and American culture. And in all honesty, it made me want to go further into the chart and really break everything bit by bit. So what's going to make this YouTube series unique is every video will be a breakdown of the planet in the nakshatra and examples of how it plays out. Once we've gone through the rasi chart, then we'll look at the house placements and do something similar. And then we will finish the series by going through America's Mahadashas, right? Now, I appreciate my audience is pretty international. So if you would like to see something similar for your country, I can do that, but I will need some help, right? So firstly, please drop the date of your country when it either got independence or you consider it to be the creation of your country. Then alongside that, if you know the time, fantastic. If not, leave that to me. And then thirdly, please make sure you add some bullet points about culture and the key events that have gone on. So then I can align it up with the chart readings. And yeah, as I said, leave some research pieces to me. I'll do the heavy lifting. Other than that, you know the routine. Grab a cup of cha, try to get comfortable, and let's have a very candid cosmic chit chat about America, because what happens in America is not only going to affect Americans, but it's also going to affect everybody else, but in a much more positive way. And I really want to remind you, look, empires don't last forever, and the process of removing rot is never meant to be clean, but it will open up room for so much better. So hang tight, keep strong. Pay attention to the messages I'm delivering you on the other platforms about community, multiculturalism, because that will be the key. And don't forget, I've already released my 2025 predictions on TikTok, on Patreon and Instagram. They'll come a little bit later to YouTube, but if you would like to know what the next few years are going to bring, feel free to check them out. Other than that, let's get down to business, Hibiscuses.
You showed me love.
So, when we begin analyzing the rasi chart for any nation, person, or thing, we always start with the Lagna. Now, the Lagna is very important because it contextualizes the rest of the chart. It really does explain why someone or something will go through the experiences that it will. It would also make us understand the paths that lay ahead for that person. And it does an excellent job at, again, really breaking down why someone or something will have the rest of the astrological placements that it does. And when you bring it all together, and you'll see throughout this series, everything will always link back to the Lagna. So let's get down to it. Now, we're already off to a very spicy start. I would expect nothing else for America. America's Lagna is Mula, right? It's a Sagittarius nakshatra. If you're super new around here, that is Sagittarius type 1 to 4. Now, let's start with analyzing the symbol of Mula, roots. How ironic, right? So when we look at the aspect of roots, there's three meanings that always come up. So number one is unrooting outdated religious, traditional, political beliefs, habits, norms that are regressive to a person, society, or somehow hindering the person from flourishing. Number two, and I think it's so interesting how God speaks through Vedic astrology. It deals with this idea of unrooting someone. Obviously, as we know, America is built on genocide. They unrooted millions of indigenous and native people of the Americas. And then number three, and again, the irony is not lost on me, a person or a nation is to understand how they are the root of all their experiences. let's break that down a little bit further. So let's begin with the first point, which was all about unrooting, we'll say unsavory or outdated beliefs. And until the person or nation does that, all they know is misery. But let's break down, well, what themes or activities are associated to Mula? I made a list, right? So with Mula tends to represent war. It represents all aspects of healthcare. So again, think about the really complex relationship that America has with mental health, the pharmaceutical industry, so on and so forth. It also deals with religious extremism. And again, at the time of recording this, Trump has just passed a bill that will focus on making sure the country is not anti-Christian, which is very ironic for a man who uses Vedic astrology himself. And again, think about America's complex journey with religion. You know, a lot of the people, the colonizers who originally came over and again genocided the Native Americans, they themselves were religious extremists, right? They were too puritanical for the European Christians, so on and so forth. And I believe that extremism has evolved over time, and it's something America as a collective has yet to move past. And I think redefine a healthy relationship with religion. It also ironically represents spy work. So again, think about the critiques of America's government, CAI, interfering in other countries, destabilizing them, trying to, collect intellectual data about countries. And again, I've always found it really interesting how, again, these are concerns of any nations, but how it's so much of a fixation for America leadership that they're hyper paranoid about other countries. And respectfully, these other countries already have great control over their data, to some extent, how to combat foreign influence that might negatively harm their citizens. And ironically, again, there's so many ironies whilst I'm even thinking about the rising sign. They're paranoid about data breaches and obviously levels of espionage that would destabilize their country, but they routinely and very normally spy on their own people without consent. We'll circle back to that later. And most importantly, and very proudly, activism. Some of the world's best, globally respected, inspiring to other culture activists have been Americans. And if we're going to get into it, a lot of them have been African Americans. We have seen storms of warriors come from the Latino community. Obviously, we cannot forget the indigenous and native people of the Americas. There's obviously few South Asians there, but not enough for my liking. Again, we have to have a conversation about how our people have been wrapped up and willingly supporting fascism. Conversation for another time. And Mula, unsurprisingly, also deals with extreme wealth and billionaires. So again, we have to consider how the Lagna sets the tone for every challenge, blessing, progression we will see in someone's chart. And when I was considering America's Lagna being Mula, all I could think about were kind of the weaknesses we see in Mula. Because again, for context, for us, we believe until a person or nation can really handle the businesses and cultivate, the blessings and the strengths that are written in the rasi chart, there can be no progression, or progression will be very fragile and they will always go back to step one. So let me outline a few of the things that I found, right? So over the 16 years of reading, these have been kind of my top traits when you're looking at the weaknesses of Mula. And again, as we go through this, I will try my best to give solutions, or again, I'll use the information I use in my own personal reading when I'm speaking to people about how to kind of navigate these things. So the first thing is, for me, Mulas are incredibly strong, but they will create their own insecurities. So the issue with Mula is, in one regard, it's considered the flower from which humanity blooms. So it's beautiful in that regard, right? It represents activism for a reason. It represents community. However, Mula, in that pursuit of I truly think freedom and doing good for other people can easily become unbalanced. And the issue is it's a classic case of wanting to achieve a goal, but justifying any means. So because the person perhaps has acted in a indecent way, it will then make them hyper paranoid that other people could do that back to them, right? And again, there's a great irony with Mula because it's one of the most strongest nakshatras I can think of, but internally deeply insecure. And a lot of that has to do with not initially being able to build solid relationships with other people. Because again, when we have community and we have trust and understanding and respect and dignity with other people, it's interesting how it lessens our insecurities and makes us paranoid or fearful about bad things. There's a calmness to the mind. I think, again, at the time of recording this, we are seeing America in record timing destroy so many alliances, and America will redefine that balance of enemies and allies. And initially it may look chaotic, but truly, in my heart of heart, it will be so good for the global south, because also in this journey, we are learning a lot of America's insecurities are self-inflicted. Now, the next point I had was a lack of appreciation for others. So again, I'm thinking of the current, and it's not even current. For me, when people critique Trump is just a manifestation of what has been allowed, what has not been fiercely opposed. And again, he is a summary of perhaps not the most palatable side of American values and histories, but because they have not successfully unrooted that, addressed that, and put in new seeds, baby, it's gonna rot your future crops. It's weeds will grow back. So again, during this time, obviously he has a lot of jargon, and as with many presidents, about what America gives to the world. It's very interesting how Americans generally are not aware how dependent they are on international countries, not just for agriculture, energy, resources, technology, business, trade. America does not manufacture or produce the work it think it does. And I think it's a great disservice that the people are not taught enough about how multiculturalism and international alliances has been a key part of American strength. But likewise, I think the leadership would find that uncomfortable, because then you would have to address the PR of it all. Because I say international alliances, but deep down, Hibiscuses, I also think there's a very candid conversation to be had about the exploitation of other international places and the normalization of exploiting them and acting like they should be grateful. The next point I had was overly focused on goals. So again, we're seeing it more vibrantly in Trump, but Trump is one of many of American leaders. It is that classic mentality of wanting to achieve something and justifying any means, even if it means it is unethical, even if it means truly it's not good for your people, even if it means only few benefit. I think that imperialistic mindset is a poison, you know? The next one is not trustworthy. So I want to do some future thinking here. So mullahs, again, can get quite a sour reputation from other people as not being trustworthy, but it's associated to this idea of wanting to achieve anything by any means. I've alluded to this a lot on Instagram, a lot on Patreon and TikTok. America's future is one of isolation, and that isolation will be self-destruction. And again, think about how America's government's inability to really care for its people, to not successfully uphold justice, have truly an equal society, not is just ruining and destroying people of their own country, it has a global impact. I think, and I talked about the anti-American sentiment that you're going to see grow a lot this year and in the coming years, and that's going to be decades worth of feeling. I essentially do not think many countries, leaders, organizations will find America trustworthy to do business because it's too insecure, it's too erratic, it's just too much. So again, you'll see that kind of play out. The next one is arrogance. I don't think we have to go into detail about this, but obviously internationally, there is a big stereotype that certain Americans carry that, and it's not very much received well. The next one is self-destruction. So again, at the time of recording this, I think one thing that would be helpful for America is to not do the blame game, because everything they're going through, what makes it so infuriating for its people, what makes it like so heartbreaking is it was all avoidable, right? And every kind of implosion you're seeing is due to a underlying self-destructive ideology, habit or norm in that society that has not been successfully addressed, shamed, and moved on from. And because there was too much sitting on the fence, because it was, I believe they call it hypernormalization. So when you normalize very awful, uncomfortable, and healthy things in society, but the people get so used to it that they just think that is the reality, that could be no norm. You're having a lot of that. You will see a lot of that in the coming months and years. The next one is stubbornness. I think this speaks for itself. The next one is sabotages their own achievements. So again, one conversation we will have, but I want to have it once I've done like other colonial and imperial empires, Vedic charts, is I think deep into the future, when they reflect on when the West truly lost its influence and fell, one of the biggest, I think, points that historians will reflect on is they did not appreciate how good they had it. And had they made simple adjustments and done A, B, and C, their empires would have carried on. But due to that stubbornness, due to that greed, due to that mindset of a colonizer, which all it knows is greed, thievery, and destruction, there again is some weird divine poetry happening where the very same things they have done to other countries is now happening in their lands. And this belligerence and not being able to see it is certain normalizations of what they think an economy should be, what healthcare, education, and all that. And all of it is based in exploitative beliefs, not in the healthiest, not in care, not in community. Everything comes full circle. The other thing that was really funny, I said rulers tend to have quite unsuccessful affairs, or like they're a little bit more prone to having a few marriages or a few partnerships under their belt. I think, again, you could liken this to America's inability to keep good diplomatic relations with its allies. There is not one ally of America who you could say has had a smooth journey with it as a country. The other things were really interesting. So the next points I had was a low tolerance for boredom. So again, I think so I'm a third culture kid. I obviously grew up between like Europe and Asia, and I worked a lot in North America for a bit, right? For me, when I'm in North America, that boredom factor is so interesting to me. Because again, in Asia, we obviously pride ourselves on this ability to, I think, be very present in our activities and our ventures in life, right? And you're kind of tested and measured on that. And then in Europe, there's a whole thing of, I think it's a social commentary in itself, but people are always kind of mocked if they're unable to kind of keep course with things, right? Like a certain level of discipline, staying switched on, and making room for other things. Like it's not too good to be absorbed by one thing. And then you see the crises of mental health in America. So I think when you look at the disposition and the health crises, especially the mental health crises in America, I don't think it's fair to say they have a low tolerance or low patience. It's been done onto them. When you romanticize capitalism, when you have no care for the children's education, when you are constantly grooming and exploiting their feelings, their sensories, it's all going to equate to some very trippy stuff. And again, even like in the research of doing this video, I was so surprised to learn that America has some of the world's lowest literacy rates. But this is meant to be considered the most powerful, richest nation on the planet. And I think, again, this is where we have to be kind to Americans. It's so weird to say this. Whilst America is unequivocally one of the biggest international terrorists ever, and again, I think history will start really documenting them like that. Sometimes I think outside of the indigenous folk, and again, the enslaved Africans of that country, are its own people. America to me is like a horrible science experiment, and it has no care for what it's doing onto its people. So when it villainizes its people and it prisons its people, it's interesting how they do not factor in the environment they have curated for their people and how they are designing them to fail and not prosper. And it's interesting who is favored to live happily and healthy in the Americas, which is weird, you know? Then I had a lot around fickle relationships, selfish, lust and anger, which again, I think that's an interesting point of the conversation, how hypersexualization has been normalized in America. I think there's interesting conversations to be had about why they are not dealing with the epidemic of sex trafficking and human trafficking in the Americas. I think when you look at America, my heart really goes out, because even as I am like reflecting on my thoughts, the clear theme is exploitation. And until they unroot the normalization of exploitation, I just think, regardless in the forms that the exploitation comes, everything is very fragile. But I'm hopeful, and I want to emphasize this enough, it actually will be unrooted, because Mula represents activism. So it was never going to be your leadership that saved you. It's grassroots movements. And the other thing I want to point out is the reason we associate Mula to wealth is because internationally it does well. We believe in free will. So as soon as Mulas learn to be balanced, they make fabulous relationships with people from foreign countries and foreign lands. It's quite a psychological sign. It's ruled by Ketu, a planet of unpaid karmic debts, clear speech, healing, bestowing treasures. All that will come, but first we have to do the heavy lifting. It's like going into the house that's been hoarding for like 15 years and you can't see the floor. You can't talk about redecorating and moving furniture in until you've removed all the fucking shit. It's going to be an ugly process. It's going to be smelly. We're probably all going to want to throw up, but the work has to be done. And the last point I wanted to point out was one thing with mulas, which is pretty, I think one of their rougher traits, it takes a lot, but gives back very little. So again, at the time of recording this, I think for me, because it's always very difficult when I make these videos, because I think of the people, and by like every means, every American I have generally met has always been a darling, right? And it's really ironic. A lot of them have what you would call like cultural shame. They're not very proud of their country. So then I don't feel like it's fair to tar them with that brush. You have to support them to, again, we know we are Asian. No, we were under the rule of British Empire for how long? It wasn't one part of South Asia that overthrew the empire. It's when those different cultures and communities came together, shared knowledge and resources, had solidarity, that they got uncomfortable. And then the riots happened. And then it was on site. We have to extend that level of commodity with the Americans. And those who are willing, give space, give refuge. Those who are not, Karmas are Karmas. Their descendants have a whole other journey that I don't care to share online, but they will get theirs. So, yeah. So in that regard, I want to make that differentiation. But again, I've always found it really interesting when you look at America's international politics in particular, or even domestic. There's almost this weird attitude of doing the bare minimum should be celebrated because at least they did it. And it's like, no, firstly, you shouldn't even have to give aid to countries. We should talk about how you destabilize them first. We should also talk about, we pour this much into countries, yes, to have soft power over those countries so you can exploit their resources. So again, the one thing I will say is that with Vedic astrology, you have to remember it's a religious practice. We are looking at the person, the nation through a lens of karmas, right? And for us, it's not about curses or blessings, but it's a law of karma, which means it doesn't care for penance, it cares for action. Until you address the karmas that you have accumulated and they are resolved, no progress can happen. And you will always have to experience the consequences of those karmas. You could perhaps lessen the fierceness of facing negative karmas by proactively picking way better decisions. So maybe what is meant to be destined to feel like a car crash could end up feeling like an inconvenient insect bite. But even then, if you think about the process of resolving karmas, a lot of it is that the person will change their mindset through that journey. Because when you're picking new actions, fundamentally, your beliefs are changing. Your demeanor is changing. Like, you are evolving and transforming, but that alchemy has to be put into way. I don't think Americans have got there quite yet. I think there is a lot more that will happen until they collectively make that come together. And remember, especially, I think you see this so much in nations' karmas, two of the biggest impacts on the experiences anyone or anything has is ancestral karmas and communal karmas. So ancestral karmas are the debts and the blessings and the knowledge you inherit from your ancestors. So parents upwards. If we cannot resolve or move away from their mistakes, then those debts get heavier and it plays out in delays, in challenges, and sometimes complete eradication. Communal karmas, again, it's wonderful as an individual if you are lovely to people that you like, and again, you are disciplined and you take good care of yourself. But that means fuck all if you cannot exist wonderfully inside of a community. And it's not just about taking from a community. What do you give? How do you show up? So again, I would always push to you guys, when learning about colonialism, one of the best things you can learn about is colonialism's interconnection to individualism and how a lot of countries, societies are suffering at the moment because of the residual effects of colonizers pushing this idea of individualism. Lands are dying, communities are suffering, and it all comes from that individualism. So when you think about communal karmas, that's a really heavy hitter. Now let's move on to point 2, which was literally about, God forbid, unrooting oneself. But in America's case, let's talk about unrooting others. As always, we must keep in mind that the Lagna contextualizes a lot of what we see happening in that nation. And I want to touch on these subjects very sensitively and sincerely, because this affects people in the current day. So I think number 1, right? When we talk about the literal act of unrooting people, the first thing that comes to mind is a genocide of Native Americans. It's absolutely abhorrent and incorrect and unethical that to this day you harm those people, and that's the land in which you chose to build a nation. And if we talk about energy and we talk about karmas, if you built a nation upon the blood, suppression, oppression, and harm and eradication of its people, the first kind of religious thought that comes to my mind is, how do you think you could ever know peace? And likewise, I appreciate what I don't appreciate. I even think in the modern day, how could you come to a country where you know there is such a normalization of harm and oppression, and this is where you want to build the future of your children? It's not right, Hibiscus is. So from the religious lens of me, I sit there and I don't understand how anybody would think the trajectory of this nation would be pleasant until its wrongs are addressed. Then again, we have to talk about the enslavement of Africans. I believe the Americans also say it's the original sin of America. I don't think it's the original sin. I think there's so much more sin before that. But even to this day, for me, I think for me, there's just a lot of outstanding karmic debt, and I'm having a hard time understanding why any person in that country would think they're entitled to peace, progression, safety, and equality, when to this very day, you still benefit from the exploitation of these people. Let me explain, right? You use their culture, you steal their knowledge, you use their people for labor, you demonize their people, use them as scapegoats. And for me, it's very interesting how and when people care about racial equality, right? So in Asia, this is a bit different for us because we tend to be quite homogenous, right? So we talk more about caste, gender, religious violence, religious discrimination, but discrimination is discrimination nonetheless. It is not right that your fellow citizen, your fellow neighbor has a radically different experience to you. And the only reason yours is joyous is because somehow, some way, you benefit from the harm of these people. Think about, again, there's conversations to be had about white supremacy. There are layers of conversations to be had about divisional politics, how they weaponize identity politics to normalize the harm and hurt of other people. And again, I'm probably rattling on, but my point is, I just don't think you can hope for good when you have still displaced these people. You have not financially ever put things right. You continue to give them and put them into literal slums. I'm having a hard time with it. And then lastly, obviously, America is famed for its interference in other countries, and they have essentially caused mass displacements. Millions and millions of folks across the world have suffered due to America and its interest and its needs and its greed. So again, if we think about Garmers and we think about 2025 being this big kind of karmic portal that opens where a lot of unaddressed ancestral stuff comes to the forefront, likewise, so do ancestors' blessings. I don't think it's too much to say that you will now understand and feel the very harm and oppression that you did to others and how you were so indifferent about displacing them, ripping them away, forcing them to work, demonizing them. You will now get a taste of your own medicine. And garments are only this vicious because you have had hundreds of years to resolve them. And the second cycle that America is currently going through is a repeat of all the other Saturns, all the other Rahuls, all the other Jupiter Mahadashas when they never course correct. Cause and effect and consequences, right? Again, we see this in their history: genocides, slaveries, wars, imperialist interventions. The potential for a deep karmic resolution is here. But until you acknowledge injustices and you pursue healing, there can be no peace. And I want to make that clear. Let's go through actually the historical actions of America. So let's talk about the genocide of Native Americans. That was the mass killing. Sorry about that, lovelies. There was a mass killing, displacement, and destruction of indigenous cultures. That constitutes in itself a heavy karmic burden, don't you think? Number two, if you talked about the karmic repercussions, you see it playing out for them now. There is natural imbalances in their environment. They have ecological disasters that for other countries are like despicable and like we would see them once every 5 years. That's a monthly occurrence in America. But again, due to media manipulation, I don't think Americans are really aware of how toxic their environment, like literally and physically is. You will have land disputes. And again, the social unrest is inevitable because you have suppressed the history and the transparency of your crimes, right? And again, I think there's something very religious and spiritual in terms of the loss of connection to the land's spiritual energy. I think is contributing to the social turbulence. I really do think in my heart of hearts, until you rectify and make peace with the indigenous and native lands of those folks, nothing. You can't have peace. And I find it weirder that people who are aware of this would choose to stay in that country. You don't remember, karmas are interconnected. So if you can normalize and become indifferent to that, eventually someone will normalize and become indifferent to your suffering. No, hibiscuses. And then we have to talk about the enslavement of Africans, right? That is forced labor. That is dehumanization. That racial violence has left like deep psychological scars on its people. And again, even on America's spiritual energy, what does that say about you as a country that you commit these, when I say atrocious, guys, I mean like, I have a thick stomach when studying like British colonial stuff, but when I learn about what goes on for Africans who are enslaved by Americans, I tap out quite quickly. And again, I think that has to impact the spiritual energy of a country that you have. Again, we have case after case, so you've normalized the harm of others, and then you're wondering how said lunatics are outside the asylum and they're your leaders now. Is this not just a manifestation of the energy that you've kept pouring in? And again, in the modern day, of course, all of that creates unresolved racial tensions, systemic inequalities. A lot of that's karmic baggage. Then let's talk about interventions and mass displacement. So from Vietnam to Middle East, millions of lives have been disrupted because of American greed. So many lives have been lost due to horrific American policies. And again, if we do some future thinking, I want to be very frank, and I keep saying it because I'm being dead serious. America will feel a boomerang effect from what it's done onto other countries, onto itself. They will go through the same political isolation, the same economic crises, and the decline of global influence and the demonization of a people it, for centuries, has put others through. If you want to get out of that, you have to course correct. And even then, you only get out of it slightly, but it's a journey you have to go through. Because again, even if you look online, if you see the conversations Americans are having, even in what the rest of the world considers like the grossest of human rights violations, the biggest crises a Western country could ever go through, there's somehow it's not clicking. And until majority click on. So again, when we look at karmic consequences, there has to be a breakdown of existing structures. Again, Mueller's power is the power to unroot, the power to break, destroy. So they are completely and adequately equipped to walk away from these structures. They're choosing not to. So that energy then goes the other way. So what you see is the breaking of economies. You see the breaking of political parties, the increase of polarization and social upheaval. Because they, again, where you put your energy matters. And that's why free will makes a big difference in terms of how we perceive you, and we can work out what you're going to go through. Again, I think America will go through a spiritual awakening, but later on. I do not think it is coming as quickly as people think it's going to come. I think the key points are still being missed from Americans. So therefore, they will, I think, continue to have some hardships due to religious extremism, stubbornness, arrogance. And again, a lot of it is they have created their own insecurities and refuse to acknowledge the truth. Probably good to point out, Maul is ruled by Nidhati, the goddess of chaos and illusions. It can be someone who can eradicate ignorance or literally drown in their own illusions and do the most spookiest of shit. And I think, again, maybe they have to go through this reckoning so they can be realigned to truth, justice, and compassion. Because, again, I feel very awkward saying this because I'm acutely aware there are thousands of Americans who are delightful. They are not represented by their government, nor these lunatics. But something has gone wrong. And until majority can move in the same direction, your focus should be, how as a collective can you get them there? And then think of the other stuff. And essentially, reparations, the necessity for the collective to acknowledge and resolve past harms is key. Otherwise, they will always repeat the past negative stuff. And it will, at some point, it will self-destruct in a final way. And there's not a rebirth. There's not a new America. There will be something new, but it won't be America. So, I mean, each and onto those persons. And also, it's probably a good time to point out, actually, this is why we don't believe in astrocartography. So, you know, where Starbucks Spirituality says your line goes here, you're meant to be in America and prosper. Do you understand why we don't promote you going to particular countries? We will say you'll do good in this environment or that environment, but so something to think about. Now let's move on to my final point about Moolah. The third point of Moolah's roots focuses on them taking responsibility for understanding how they are the root of all their experiences and, most importantly, suffering. And it's not lost on me how the ruling devata of Moolah is Niriti, the goddess of chaos and illusions. For me, it's insane how much America is now being forced to confront the illusionary aspect of them being a democracy. You know, if you think about everything we've seen unfold, I think one thing that was interesting for everyday Americans to go through is learn they're actually not free. They talk about we have free speech and the right to freedom, but you have no choices. Even then, to see America spend decades priding itself on being a human rights defender, and now that mask slipping due to its chaotic behavior. And again, all these smokes and mirrors that have gone into America's PR to make it look savory and friendly and to kind of soften, again, what I can only describe as like grave human rights violations is insane. Like, I look at everything and I'm like, even if I wasn't doing Jetosh, I feel logically anybody could come to these conclusions that you did this is the consequence, and now you have to sit through it, because what on earth? And as we know, many historians always say empires have a limited time. Sure, they can go for long bouts, but no empire ever really survives. So again, if we go back to this idea of we're the root of all our experiences, I actually made a list of all the stuff that America has done to other countries, and I want you to think about how it could come back onto them, and they have to understand they are the root of all their experiences. So number one, let's start with, I'm going to mispronounce it, guys. Sorry, I have a speech impediment. Guatemala, right? The CIA orchestrated a coup to overthrow President Jacob Arbenz, fearing his land reforms threaten US business interests. Chile, 1973. The CIA supported a coup that ousted democratically elected President Salvador Allende, leading to Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. Nicaragua, this is 1980s. The US funded and trained Contra rebels to destabilize the socialist Sandinista government. Panama, 1989. The US forces invaded Panama to remove military leader Manuel Noriega. I'm just going to say one word: Cuba. Then we have Middle East. Iran, 1953. The US and Britain orchestrated Project Ajax. They overthrew the Prime Minister, Mohamed Mossadegh, after he nationalized the oil industry. Iraq, 2001 to 2023 and onwards. The US-led invasion, justified by allegations of weapons of mass destruction, led to years of conflict and political instability that is still felt today. Syria, the 2010s under Obama. The US supported rebel groups during the Syrian civil war, contributing to the ongoing unrest. Libya, 2011. US NATO intervention contributed to the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, resulting in a power vacuum and chaos. Let's talk about Asia next. Vietnam, from the 1950s to 1975, extensive military involvement to counter-spread communism, destabilize the region. Afghanistan, 1980s to the early 2000s to this day. The US supported Mujahideen fighters against Soviet forces and later invaded to topple the Taliban, contributing to prolonged conflict. Then you have the Cambodia, this happened in 1970s. You had the US bombings and support for a coup to destabilize the nation, paving way for the Khmer Rouge. Let's talk about Africa. Let's start with Congo. Congo to this day is still assaulted by America. Congo is exploited and quite literally raped for minerals. The CIA backed the removal and assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, who basically told Westerners to fuck off with their money. They didn't want anything and he can build it themselves because they're rich. Then you have Somalia in the 1990s. The US intervention during the Civil War contributed to the ongoing instability. Then you have Sudan, which America fucks around with. Then you have, again, let's go back to Libya 2011. As mentioned earlier, NATO-led involvement worsened political chaos. If you had, this is just FYI, that's 1/4 research. If I sat here, I could create a whole other YouTube video about US interference. So, what did we talk about? Ancestral karma, communal karmas, and their karmas boomeranging back onto them. If your money, your influence only comes from provoking war, destabilizing, embedding religious extremism, all of this crap, don't you think God is a comedian? And at some point, you will then experience everything else that you have done onto others. That's why I'm telling you, I'm not angry at Trump. Trump for me is not the villain you think he is. He is simply a byproduct of American values and norms. Because if it wasn't Trump, it would have been something else. Again, I think it's important to call out critiques where people are like, oh, he's so horrible. No, your previous regimes, and that's what you live under, our regimes, were doing this. Obama is the #1 president from bombing the most people in the Middle East. Your Democrat-led leader started the Palestinian genocide and let it go on for 18 months. We can talk about Bush if you like. We can definitely spitball about fucking Clintons. But it's always the same people. It's not a different side. The issue is it's rotted values and rotted ideologies and a rotted mindset. Until it's cleaned, what do you expect? In fact, let me quickly break down karmas to you actually. So, look at this note over here. These are some of the different types of karmas. Think about how that would impact America. And you have to remember, this is their Lagna we're talking about. This is essentially their personal North Star. They haven't even made peace with their Lagna's karmas. As we go through this series, this is what you're going to see. We're going to see what the sign represents. We're going to see what it could be and what it hasn't been. And then I'll give you examples of how stuff is played out. And you tell me if, as a religious practice who looks at the whole world through lenses of karmas, what do you think is going to happen here? And you can understand why it happens. And my thing here is we must never forget Mula represents activism. Perhaps a destruction is necessary, so things that are hindering true liberty, true equality, true multiculturalism, true community can flourish. Because there's no way you can keep building on the same foundation with the same mindset and expect different results or any peace and prosperity. As we wrap up part 1 of my series breaking down America's chart, I wanted to finish with this message. Mula is so much about destruction, but what it's talking about is the willing and proactive journey of destroying our most inner poisonous and destructive qualities so we can be liberated. We can move and groove with clarity. And again, we are not disturbed by paranoid thoughts. And it's really interesting because traditionally, when you look at Lagna being in Mula, it's this. The person must learn how to exist and contribute peacefully to a diverse community. If it cannot, and let's say it spends a bulk of its time just causing a lot of harm, fueling into some of those attributes that I laid out earlier, which were not too grand, then karma has to play out. And what is that karma? If you cannot appreciate community, you cannot appreciate different types of thoughts, you cannot, for whatever reason, stop being dogmatic, then what God will do is isolate you. Because the same way you want to have dominance over others, well, will let you dominate all you want, but by yourself. And that self-isolation will then allow for the nastiest destructions to occur. And then it's anticipated once the destructions occurred, and if it has to be that intense, it's because the person or nation has left God no other choice, then they will learn. A reminder, mother is the flower from which humanity blooms. So you don't want to coexist with humanity. You have no respect for humanity. Perhaps you'll care for it, respect it, and appreciate it when you understand the power of multiculturalism, the power of interconnections with different cultures. But until then, that's all there can be. And please remember what I've been saying for the last few years on my other social media pages. We were going through a very intense process of astrological death and rebirth. That process was the catalyst for the downfall of colonialism you're going to see play out for many decades. Empires, both seen and hidden, are about to fall and crumble. And thank God, because if they only exist on the oppression of others, I don't want them. I don't want to be a part of them, and nor should you. But like I said, especially the stuff that you did in 2024, it will lay the bed of karmas that you will experience for the next 2 decades, beginning in 2025. And at the time of remaking this video for YouTube, it's early February 2025. I think you can understand how that's going to play out. But my hope is, perhaps after seeing the true fruits of these terrible beliefs, these very questionable norms, that is enough to inspire people to change and not to keep implementing tokens and puppets and essentially changing the mask for a very ugly mindset. And hopefully it will make you appreciate the world more instead of demonizing them, destabilizing them, disrespecting them, because it's not lost on me at all. There's a gag to be said. It's a nation full of immigrants, but who do they hate the most? Other than that, welcome to the series. Follow me for part 2. Let's talk about America's sun sign, shall we?